The smell hit Paul first, a thick mix of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp burn of overworked plasma generators. The underground market reeked of desperation and greed. Heavy, damp air stuck to his skin like a second layer of clothing as he pushed through the crowded space. This wasn't his first time in a place like this. Paul had walked through dozens of black market dens, each one worse than the last. Tonight's location was no different, a maze of shadows and flickering lights where the galaxy's worst criminals gathered to trade in misery. He kept his face blank, his steps steady. Around him, creatures from every corner of space haggled over stolen goods. Weapons dealers whispered prices for illegal blasters. Spice runners showed off their latest drugs. And then there were the slavers, the ones Paul hated most. The Federation had sent him here for a reason. 3 months he'd spent building this cover, learning names, mapping routes, earning trust. Soon, his team would strike. They'd shut down this entire network and free every prisoner they could find. But tonight, he was just another buyer in the crowd. Paul moved deeper into the market, past vendors selling cybernetic parts and black market medicines. The sounds around him were a mix of alien languages, mechanical beeps, and nervous laughter. Neon signs buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh colors: red, blue, green, making the whole place feel like a fever dream. The auction area sat at the center of it all, a raised platform surrounded by eager bidders, all waiting to buy their next piece of human cargo. Paul's stomach turned, but he kept walking. He needed to see who was being sold tonight. Intelligence gathering, nothing more. That's when he saw her. She stood on the auction block like she owned it. Her shoulders were straight, her chin lifted high. Even under the harsh lights, her emerald green skin seemed to glow. Long white hair flowed down her back, moving slightly as she shifted her weight. Most slaves looked broken by the time they reached auction. They cried, begged, or stared at nothing with empty eyes. Not this one. She looked around the crowd like a queen studying her subjects. No fear in those silver eyes, no pleading, just waiting. Paul found himself staring. This woman was different, dangerous maybe. The way she held herself, the way she watched everything, she didn't look like a victim at all. The auctioneer, a thin creature with too many arms, called for attention. Beautiful specimen here. Look at those markings, that skin, perfect for any collection. Paul felt sick. He wanted to leave, but moving now might draw attention. He stayed put, telling himself this was just part of the job. Gather information. Don't get involved. The bidding started low. A few scattered calls from the crowd. The woman never looked at the bidders. She kept her eyes forward, calm and patient. Then, someone bumped into Paul. It happened fast, a figure in a dark hood, moving through the crowd like smoke. Paul felt something brush against his belt. His training kicked in before he could think. He spun around, grabbing the thief's wrist just as they tried to slip away. The hooded figure hissed, pulling free and disappearing back into the crowd. But the damage was done. Paul's sudden movement had caught attention. Worse, his arm was still raised from grabbing the pickpocket. 200 credits. The auctioneer announced, pointing directly at Paul. Our newcomer makes the first real bid. Paul's blood went cold. No, this wasn't happening. He tried to lower his hand, but eyes were already on him. A dozen different species turned to look, their faces showing interest, amusement, suspicion. He couldn't back out now. Not without raising questions. Not without blowing 3 months of careful work. 300. Someone called from the back, a voice like gravel in a blender. Paul's mind raced. He was trapped. If he walked away now, people would wonder why. They might ask questions he couldn't answer. But if he kept bidding, the auctioneer grinned, showing too many teeth. Will our generous guest respond? Paul forced himself to breathe. Slowly, one bid. Just one more. Then let someone else win. He could make this work. 500, he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. Murmurs rippled through the gathered aliens. The previous bidder, a slug-like creature with multiple eyes, turned to study Paul more carefully. He could see it thinking, calculating. Had Paul bid too high? Too low? For a long moment, nobody spoke. The slug thing considered raising the bid again, its eyes never leaving Paul's face. Then, with a disgusted wave of one slimy arm, it gave up. Paul barely had time to understand what had happened before the auctioneer slammed his gavel down. Sold. The sound echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. Paul stood frozen as 2 guards moved toward the platform. They unlocked the woman's restraints with practiced ease, but she didn't wait for them to escort her down. The moment her hands were free, she stepped off the platform and walked straight toward Paul. She moved with purpose, like she knew exactly what she was doing. When she reached him, she placed both hands on his chest and looked up into his eyes. "Husband," she said simply. Paul blinked. "What? You have chosen me," she continued, her voice steady and sure. "I am yours now." Before Paul could respond, she turned to face the crowd. In a voice that carried to every corner of the room, she announced, "I leave with my mate." Laughter burst from the gathered slavers. Some clapped, others made crude comments in languages Paul didn't want to understand. His carefully planned mission was falling apart, and he had no idea how to stop it. The woman had called him her mate, in front of everyone. Now they'd be watching to see what happened next. Watching to see if Paul really was who he claimed to be. "We need to go," Paul said quietly, wrapping his fingers around her wrist. Not rough, but firm enough to guide her. Now, she didn't resist. If anything, she seemed pleased. Together, they moved through the crowd, Paul fighting to keep his pace. Normal, running would only make things worse. They were almost at the exit when a voice stopped them. "Expensive prize you've got there." Paul didn't turn around. Not interested in talking, a heavy hand landed on his shoulder. "I think you are." Paul's training took over. He twisted, driving his elbow into the speaker's gut. The alien doubled over, gasping for air. But before Paul could follow up, the woman was already moving. She flowed like water, striking like lightning. One moment she was beside Paul, the next she was driving her knee into another guard's ribs. The second guard tried to grab her, but she spun away, catching him across the jaw with her fist. It was over in seconds. Both guards were down, and she was back at Paul's side like nothing had happened. "We should move faster, husband," she said calmly. "Stop calling me that," Paul muttered. She just smiled. Then the alarms started screaming. "Run," Paul shouted. They ran. Blaster fire erupted behind them, red bolts of energy searing through the air where they'd been standing. Paul yanked the woman behind a stack of cargo containers, pulling out his own stolen weapon to return fire. She didn't flinch at the shots. She didn't duck or cry out. If anything, she looked excited. That scared Paul more than the blasters. "This way," he called, leading her through the maze of corridors toward the docking bay. His ship waited at the far end, the Sirius, a sleek vessel built for speed and stealth. The alarms were getting louder, echoing off the metal walls. Soon every slaver in the district would be hunting them. The woman kept pace beside him easily, never stumbling, never looking back. Her white hair streamed behind her as they ran, and those silver eyes were bright with something Paul couldn't name. She was enjoying this. Workers in the docking bay barely looked up as they sprinted past. Either they were used to violence, or they were smart enough to mind their own business. Paul didn't care which, as long as they stayed out of the way. Heavy footsteps pounded behind them, shouts in a dozen different languages. The slavers were getting closer. Paul reached his ship and slammed his palm on the entry scanner. The hatch hissed open just as the first pursuers rounded the corner behind them. He pushed the woman inside and followed, sealing the door behind them. The cockpit was small but efficient. Paul threw himself into the pilot's seat and started the launch sequence, fingers flying over the controls. The engines hummed to life, vibrating through the deck plates. Outside, security teams were scrambling, but they were too late. By the time they reached the docking bay, the Sirius was already rising, its thrusters burning bright as it climbed toward the polluted sky. Paul glanced at his passenger. She'd settled into the co-pilot's seat like she belonged there, watching their escape with obvious pleasure. She wasn't scared. She wasn't grateful. She was entertained. "That was fun," she said, turning to look at him with that same knowing smile. "Fun?" Paul shook his head. "We almost died back there. But we didn't." Her smile widened. "You fight well, husband. Stop calling me that." She laughed, a rich, warm sound that made something flutter in Paul's chest despite everything. "Would you prefer mate? Or perhaps beloved? Your species has so many words for it." Paul focused on the controls, guiding them through the planet's upper atmosphere. Stars appeared beyond the view screen, bright points of light in the endless dark. Once they were clear of the gravity well, he engaged the jump drive. Reality twisted around them, space folding in on itself. Then, suddenly, they were somewhere else entirely. The slaver world was gone, replaced by empty space and distant stars. Only then did Paul allow himself to relax. He turned to face the woman, crossing his arms over his chest. All right, he said. We need to talk. She stretched, the movement slow and deliberate. The dim cockpit lighting played across her green skin, highlighting the strange markings that ran along her arms and shoulders. She looked like some kind of warrior queen, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Ask your questions, husband, she said. Paul pinched the bridge of his nose. First of all, I didn't choose you. That was an accident. She raised one elegant eyebrow. And yet here I am, in your ship, fleeing your enemies, with your name. I don't even know your name. You didn't ask. Paul waited. When she didn't volunteer the information, he sighed. What's your name? Zara? She tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. And you are? Paul Chen, Federation Intelligence. Paul went very still. How do you know who you are? Zara's smile turned predatory. Oh, my dear husband, we have much more to discuss than you realize. Upon my lips, Paul narrowed his eyes. You don't even know my name. Her lips quirked. Tell me. Then he hesitated. Something about the way she said it felt like a trap, but she was watching him expectantly, waiting. Paul, she repeated it, testing the sound. Then slowly she smiled. Paul. A strong name he refused to acknowledge. The way her voice made it sound almost intimate. Turn, he said instead. She leaned forward slightly, silver eyes locked on his Nyx. Paul studied her. The name suited her. Mysterious. Dangerous. All right, Nyx. What the hell were you doing in that auction? Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. A calculation. I was taken, she said simply. By who? Weak men who thought chains could hold me. Paul exhaled sharply. You didn't exactly seem helpless back there. Nyx smiled. Did you want me to be? He didn't dignify that with an answer. If you were capable of escaping, he didn't you? She leaned back as if considering. Because I was waiting. Paul frowned. For what? Nyx's gaze never wavered. For you. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Paul forced himself to move past it. It's not an answer. She only shrugged. Perhaps it is not one you are ready to hear. Paul gritted his teeth. This conversation was going nowhere. He pushed off the console and stood. You can sleep in the back. There's a spare bunk. Nyx blinked. Sleep already? She tilted her head, giving him a slow, knowing look. Are you nervous? Paul leveled her with a flat stare. Not in the slightest. She hummed, rising fluid light on her feet, too fluidly. Paul had seen fighters move like that before. Like every step was deliberate, like every shift of weight could become an attack if needed. And then she invaded his space. Didn't back away, but she was close enough now that he could feel the warmth of her body, close enough that her scent curled around him, earthy like rain-drenched forests, but with something deeper, something dangerous. Her fingers trailed lightly over his chest, plate barely touching. You're tense. Paul caught her wrist before she could press for theory. Don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but a game? Her lips parted slightly, amusement flickering across her face. Oh, no, Paul. This is not a game. This is a claim. His grip tightened fractionally. I don't belong to any. Onyx smile, slow and deliberate. Not yet. Paul released her and stepped back. The spare bunk is down the hall. Stay out of my bed. Nyx sighed dramatically. A pity. It looks warm. Paul turned and walked away before she could say anything else. A bit as he reached the doorway, her voice followed him, rich with certainty. You will come around, husband. Paul gritted his teeth and kept walking. Paul had slept through ambushes before he had woken up in the middle of firefights, disoriented but moving, an instinct taking over before his mind could catch up. But waking up to her perched at the edge of his bed, watching him with quiet amusement, was somehow more unsettling than any battlefield. For a moment, he just stared. Nyx sat comfortably, legs tucked beneath her, silver eyes gleaming in the dim light. Her long white hair cascaded over her shoulders, the strands catching the glow of the ship's consoles, the faint luminescent markings along her emerald green skin pulsed softly, almost hypnotic. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Paul exhaled slowly and ran a hand down his face. I thought I told you to stay in your own bunk. Nyx smiled, tilting her head slightly. You did. She didn't move. Paul sat up, the sheets rustling as he swung his legs over the side of the bed, putting some distance between them. Then why are you here? Nyx's gaze followed him, unbothered by his attempt to create space. You still do not understand. Paul clenched his jaw. He was tired, physically, mentally, emotionally. I didn't have the patience for whatever game she was playing. What exactly am I supposed to understand, Nix? She stared at him for a long moment, then shifted closer. Not enough to touch, but enough that he could feel her warmth, her presence, wrapping around him like a tangible thing. Among my people, she said, her voice softer now, more certain. To be chosen in battle is the highest honor. Paul frowned. What does that mean? It means you are my bond. The word sent a slow, cold ripple down his spine. Nix's gaze never wavered. I was taken in chains, stripped of my weapons, my honor. I had no name, no right to fight. I was nothing, she paused, her silver eyes gleaming. Until you stood. Paul's breath caught. You fought for me, Nix continued, her voice like a blade slipping between his ribs, not as a slaver, not as a master, but as a warrior. You saw me, and you chose me. She reached up, tracing the faint luminescent lines along her arm. Among my kind, thesis unbreakable. A bond forged in battle cannot be severed. It is beyond words, beyond choice. It simply is. Paul inhaled sharply. Nix, I didn't know. It does not matter what you knew. Her voice was calm, absolute. The moment you raised your hand for me, I became yours, and you mine. A slow, dangerous silence settled between them. Paul's mind raced, trying to find a way to untangle this. AR argued to explain that it was a mistake, but for the first time since they'd met, he hesitated. She wasn't playing a game. She wasn't teasing. This was real to her. Paul dragged a hand down his face, exhaling sharply. Nix, humans don't work like that. We don't just bind ourselves to people because of one moment. Nix blinked as if he had said something ridiculous. That is why your kind is so lost. Paul stiffened. Excuse me. She gave him a small, knowing smile. You fight alone, you live alone. You push away those who would stand beside you. And for what? He opened at his mouth to argue, but she kept going. You did not hesitate when the battle came. You did not look away from me, did not leave me behind. Why then do you hesitate now? Paul swallowed hard. Because she was right. Because some part of him, some stupid bar part, had felt something when she called him hers. And that scared him more than any bounty hunter, more than any battlefield. He stood abruptly, needing to get away from this conversation before it pulled him under. You should get some sleep. We'll be landing at a neutral station in a few hours. NYX watched him, her silver eyes gleaming. I am patient, Paul. She smiled, slow and certain. But you are mine whether you accept it now or later. Paul turned and left before he did something insanely stupid. Hours later, Paul sat in the cockpit running diagnostics on their next jump. He told himself he was focused, that his mind was clear, but every so often his thoughts drifted to her words, to her certainty, to the way her silver eyes saw straight through him. He was still trying to shake it off when the ship's proximity alarm blared. Paul's fingers flew over the controls, scanning for the incoming threat. A sleek, dark vessel had just dropped out of 4 fast Predatorian, closing in on their position. The cum crackled to life. Unidentified vessel, power down and prepare to be boarded. Paul's grip tightened on the throttle. Nick stepped into the cockpit, her expression shifting instantly. No teasing, no amusement, just sharp, calculating focus. Who is it? Paul didn't take his eyes off the screen. Trouble? Nix's gaze flicked to. Hyman, readable for you. Paul's jaw tightened. For us. The bounty hunter's ship was fast, too fast. Paul's hands gripped the controls as warning lights flickered across the dashboard. The sleek black vessel on their tail had cut through their TTL wake like a blade through silk, closing in with brute brow efficiency. Whatever they weren't amateurs. The cum crackled again. Unidentified vessel. Power down your engines and prepare to be boarded. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force. Paul clenched his jaw. He'd heard that line before. It was the standard greeting of hunters who didn't particularly care whether their targets were dead or alive. Nick stood beside him, her silver eyes locked onto the scanner display. Despite the tension in the air, she was calm. Paul glanced at her. I don't suppose you have any long-lost enemies I should know about? She smirked. More than I can count, husband. But I suspect this is about you. Paul didn't argue. It was possible the Slavers had already put a bounty on his head for interfering with their operation. Or maybe it was something worse. Someone from his past coming to collect a debt he hadn't realized was due. No time to figure the two now. The targeting system blared a proximity alert. They were locking weapons. Paul slammed the throttle, sending the ship into a sharp dive. The artificial gravity groaned, struggling to compensate as they rocketed downward. The bounty ship followed, precise and relentless, a warning shot streak past their hull close enough to rattle the shields. NYX braced herself against the console, her voice steady. They will not stop. Paul gritted his teeth. They never do. His mind ran through his options, heckled and outrun them. Not in open space, not in a ship built for survival, not speed. But if he could force them into a disadvantage, his gaze flicked to the star charts. There, a rogue asteroid, field just beyond the next gravity well, dense and stable, the perfect place to make a hunter rethink their pursuit. Paul adjusted their trajectory. The engines whined in protest as he pushed them to their limit, streaking toward the asteroid field. Nyx watched him, her expression vulnerable. You are either very brave or very reckless. Bit of both, Paul muttered. The bounty ship followed Paul through the first cluster of rocks, skimming so close to the surface of a drifting mass that the ship's proximity alarms screamed in protest. The bounty hunter wasn't deterred. They stayed on him, they piloting precise. Nyx exhaled sharply. They are skilled. Not skilled enough. Paul's fingers danced over the controls, retuning power to the AF thrusters. He waited just a second longer, until the scanner blipped, confirming the hunter had fully committed to the chase. Then he cut the engines. The ship lurched. As inertia took over. For a split second, they were weightless, drifting dead through space. The bounty hunter had no time to react. They overshot their trajectory, carrying them forward right into the dense field of asteroid. Paul reignited the thrusters. At the last possible second, banking hard in the opposite direction behind them, the bounty ship swerved too late. A massive asteroid clipped their hull, sending them spinning wildly into the debris field. Paul didn't wait to see if they're covered. He gunned the engines, breaking free of the field and punching in the next set of coordinates. The ship roared of TTL, leaving their pursuers behind. Only then did he let himself breathe, and studied him for a long moment before letting out a soft, appreciative, "Hume impressive." Paul shot her a look. You doubted me? She smirked. Not at all. Simply enjoy watching you work. Paul sailed, running a hand through his hair. Just made enemies. That was a high-profile ship, which means someone with real credits wants us off the board. Nyx leaned against the console, unconcerned. We will handle them when the time comes. Paul frowned. You really not worried about this? She shrugged. I have spent my life being hunted. This is no different. That gave him pause. Paul had seen plenty of fighters in his time, mercenaries, soldiers, bounty hunters. Most of them either burned out young or drowned themselves in vices to numb the constant state of survival. But Nyx, she thrived in it. She saw danger and laughed. She was bound to him now, with no guarantees of safety, no certainty about the future. And yet she was happy. That was something Paul couldn't wrap his head around. Nyx must have caught the confusion on his face, because she tilted her head, studying him. Then to his surprise, she softened, not teasing, not smug, just. I was meant to die in chains, she said, and yet here I stand beside a man who fought for me, who flies through the stars with me. She spread her arms slightly, as if embracing the very air around her. Do you not see? This is freedom. Paul stared at her. Freedom? I had never thought of it like that. For him, freedom had always been just another word for running. Running from thief, iteration, from enemies, from debts unpaid. But to her it wasn't escape. It wasn't survival, it was belonging. Paul swallowed hard, suddenly feeling like he was the one out of his depth. Nyx smiled, stepping closer. One day you will understand. Paul's breath hitched as she reached up, fingers grazing his jaw. Not forceful, not a claim, just a quiet promise. Then, just as easily as she had invaded his space, she pulled away. Come husband, let us decide our next move. Paul exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. He was in so much trouble. The ship thrummed with energy, the silence stretching between them thick with anticipation. Paul worked quickly at the controls, fingers flying over the console, rerouting power to the shields and weapons. The incoming bounty hunters weren't hesitating. They had locked on at them the moment Voss's transmission ended. Paul didn't look at Nyx, but he could feel her standing beside him, too still to calm when he risked a glance. She wasn't tense or anxious like most people would be in this situation. No, she was watching the scanners with a glint of amusement, as if she were eager. Paul let out a slow breath. You look way too relaxed for someone about to be outgunned. Nyx smirked. They should be. Theon's afraid, husband. He shot her a look. 2 bounty ships heavily armed against us. She tilted, her head silver, eyes gleaming. Yes, Paul exhaled. You're insane. Nick stepped closer, her body brushing against his as she leaned in. And yet you like that about me. Before Paul could even think of a response, the cow crackled to life. A different voice, this time female, cold and sharp. Paul Wren, you're harboring a high-value fugitive. Surrender now and will not turn your ship into scrap metal. Paul flicked the switch to respond. Counter offer. How about you leave and I won't kill you? A pause, then a low. Chuck Liu always were an arrogant bastard. Paul stiffened. His grip on the control tightened. He knew that voice. Nix's gaze flicked to him, sensing his reaction. So Paul's jaw tensed. Used to the woman on the other end side should have. Figured you wouldn't make this easy. A second later, the first blast the ship lurched, shields flaring against the impact. Paul gritted his teeth, gripping the controls as the ship rattled. NYX didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached out her fingers, brushing against Paul's arm. Not urgent, not panic, just grounding. Paul exhaled, steadying himself, but the moment her tuck left him, he already missed it. No time for that. He twisted the ship into a tight dive, engines burning hot as he forced their pursuers into a chassis. Wanted a hunt, he'd give them one. Nick stepped away, moving toward Thuyapon's console. Paul barely had time to process the shift before she was already scanning the targeting interface. Locking targets. Paul's fingers paused over the controls. You sure about that? Nick gave him a look. You assume I was only trained to fight with blades? He didn't argue, but damn was she full of surprises. A warning shot grazed the shields, jolting them sideways. NX didn't hesitate. She fired a direct hit. The first bounty ship shields flickered violently before collapsing entirely. Paul whistled. Not bad. Nick smirked, adjusting the turret's angle. You should see what I can do with a proper weapon. The second bounty ship wasn't backing off. If anything, it was accelerating. Paul's gut twisted. They weren't trying to destroy them. They were trying to board them. Next, she was already moving. She crossed the cockpit with that same predatory grace, her fingers brushing against his back as Shep asked. Not an accident. Paul clenched his jaw. She disappeared down the corridor and within seconds she returned, armed to the teeth. A sleek blaster sat snug against her hip, a plasma knife strapped to her thigh. And was that his backup pulse rifle? Paul scowled. Did you rob my armory while I wasn't looking? Nick smirked, adjusting the strap across her chest. You left it unlocked. It's fingerprint locked. She tilted her head, silver eyes gleaming. I am very good with locks. Paul didn't have time to argue. The bounty ship latched onto them, docking clamp singing with a heavy cal. The ship's alarms wailed. Paul grabbed his sidearm, checking the charge. We've got incoming. NYX rolled her shoulders, expression turning, sharp, predatory. Good. I was starting to get bored. Paul shot her a look. You really need to work on your definition of fun. Stepped closer, voice dropping to something dangerously soft. Oh, husband? I can think of many things more fun than this. Then before he could react, she leaned in, her lips brushing his jaw just enough for it to coil low in his stomach. Paul's breath hitched. She grinned, and then the airlock hissed open. Blaster fire erupted, and the fight began. Plaster fire streaked through the narrow corridor, slamming into the bulkheads and sending sparks flying. Paul ducked behind a cargo crate, heart pounding as he fired off a quick retaliatory shot. The bounty hunters were fast. They had anticipated resistance, moving in tight formation, their weapons trained on every possible angle of attack. He risked a glance at Nixon. She was already in motion. She moved like a shadow, fluid and unpredictable. One moment she was pressed against the wall, the next she was lunging, weaving through the blaster fire like she had memorized the pattern. Before it was even fired, a bounty hunter took aim at her, but before he could pull the trigger, she was already on him. One smooth motion, and her plasma knife sliced across his throat. The man choked, his weapon slipping from his fingers. Before he crumpled to the floor, Paul barely had time to process it before she grabbed the fallen blaster and spun, shooting another attacker square in the chest. Paul exhaled sharply. She was terrifying. Another shot whizzed past his ear, yanking him back to the present. He fired twice, hitting his mark, then moved to flank the remaining hunters. The ship shook as an explosion rocked the outer hull. A warning flashed red on the console. They were trying to breach the cockpit. Paul swore under his breath. They're cutting through the damn hull. Nix, we need to move. She didn't hesitate, grabbing a discarded grenade from one of the fallen hunters. She yanked the pin with her teeth and tossed it toward the airlock. Paul's eyes widened. Are you insane? That'll blow. The explosion detonated before he could finish the shock. Wave rattling through the ship, the remaining hunters were thrown backward, their bodies hitting the walls with sickening thuds. Smoke and debris filled the air, but the breach was sealed. Nyx had thrown it with such precision that the explosion had destroyed only their attackers, leaving the hull intact. Paul turned to her, half impressed, half horrified. "You could have warned me," Nyx smirked, blowing a strand of white hair from her face. "You would have told me not to." Paul shook his head, but there wasn't time to argue. Hegra bit her hand and pulled her toward the cockpit. "We need to get out of here before reinforcements arrive." Nyx did not resist. In fact, she let him pull her closer, so close that he could feel the warmth of her against his back. As Theron, his ship was a mess. Alarms blaring, warning lights flashing, but the engines were still functional. That was all that mattered. Paul slid into the pilot's chair, fingers flying over the controls. "Hold on to something." NX leaned over him instead, her lips grazing the shell of his ear. "I will hold on to you, husband." Paul nearly choked on air. She was doing this on purpose. With a sharp exhale, he wrenched the controls and sent the ship into a violent dive, disengaging from the bounty hunters' docking clamps. The force of the maneuver ripped them free, sending their attacker's ship spinning out of control. Nyx didn't flinch. Paul grit his teeth, eyes scanning the scanner. The second bounty ship was still on TerraTales. "Jam it," he muttered. Nyx's hand slid over his shoulders, slow and deliberate. "You're tense," she murmured, her lips grazing dangerously close to his neck. Paul gripped the throttle harder. "Because we're about to die." Nyx chuckled. "No, we are not." Paul was about to argue when she pulled away and grabbed the co-pilot's controls. She flicked a switch. A second later, one of the ship's dorsal cannons fired, striking the bounty ship's wing at the perfect angle. The vessel veered off course, smoke pouring from the damaged thrusters. Paul blinked. Nyx smirked, leaning back as she traced her fingers down his arm. "You are good, husband, but I am better." Paul exhaled sharply, focusing on the navcom. "We need a place to lay low now." Nyx hummed, "considering there is a system not far from here. Remote, hidden." Paul narrowed his eyes. "And you just happen to know a place?" She smiled. "I am full of surprises." Paul didn't trust it, but right now he didn't have a better option. He punched in the coordinates. The ship lurched into TTL, leaving the wreckage behind. Silence filled the cockpit. Paul exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Nyx stepped closer, too close. He turned, about to tell her to give him space, but few words died in his throat as her hand slid over his chest. "His breathing hitched knee," he warned. She tilted her head, silver eyes bright with something wicked. "You fight so hard against me, Paul." She was too warm, too close. And after everything, the battle, the adrenaline, the near-death chase, his body ached with exhaustion, with tension, with something else entirely. Nyx felt it. Her fingers traced the collar of his shirt, slow, deliberate. "I told you before," she murmured, voice silk and fire. "You belong to me now." Paul swallowed hard. "That's not how this works." Nyx's lips curved. "Then show me how it works, husband." Before he could argue, she closed the distance, her lips crashing against his. Paul's brain short-circuited. Every instinct screamed at him to push hair away, to regain control of the situation too. But God's help him, he kissed. Her back heat coiled in his gut, sharp and overwhelming. His hands moved before Heckled stopped them, gripping her waist, pulling her against him. Nyx let out a pleased sound, her fingers tangling in his hair. The kiss was war, not gentle, not hesitant. A battle neither wanted to lose. When she finally pulled back, her lips were kiss-swollen, her breath uneven. Paul was no better. Nyx smirked. "So you surrender?" Paul exhaled, resting his forehead against hers. "You're impossible." Her fingers traced his jaw. "Featherlight. And you love it." Paul didn't answer because they both knew she was right. Days passed, then weeks. For the first time since it all began, there was no one hunting them. No bounty hunters dropping out of TTL. No encrypted threats over the cows. No whispers of Kieran Voss's reach creeping closer. They were free. Paul wasn't sure when it had truly sunk in, when the tension in his holders had finally eased, when he had stopped waking in the middle of the night expecting alarms to blare. Maybe it was the first morning he had woken up to silence, not the hum of an impending chase. Or maybe it was now standing at the edge of the cockpit, watching Nyx laugh under the soft glow of a distant sun. She was outside, perched on the hull of the ship, her long white hair catching the golden light as she leaned back against the metal. He should have told her to be careful, that the hull wasn't meant for lounging, that one wrong step would send her tumbling into space, but she looked so at ease, so perfectly content that he didn't have the heart to ruin it. Instead, Paul exhaled and stepped out onto the hull beside her. Nix tilted her head as he approached, silver eyes combing with quiet amusement. "You finally joined me," Paul grunted, folding his arms. "Someone has to keep you from drifting into the void." Nix smirked. "Ami, ever dutiful protector." He rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Silence settled between them. Not tense, not weighted with unspoken things like before, just comfortable. Paul stared out at the view before them, a remote system untouched by war or trade routes, planets with ocean that shimmered like liquid sapphire, moons hanging in the distance like polished pearls. It was beautiful. Heckle didn't remember the last time he had stopped to actually look at something like this. Nick shifted beside him, stretching like a cat basking in the warmth of a star. "You are restless," she observed. Paul huffed. "I'm used to running." Nick's turned, studying him for a long moment. "You do not have to run anymore." Paul's jaw tensed. It should have been that simple, shouldn't it? No more enemies breathing down his neck, no more fights waiting in the shadows, but part of him still felt coiled, still prepared for the moment peace would slip through his fingers like it always did. Nick seemed to understand that. Without him saying a word, she leaned in, pressing warm lips to his jaw, soft, brief, a touch that wasn't a demand and just a reminder. Paul sighed, letting his eyes close. For just a second, Nick smirked against his skin. "You will adjust, husband." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "You really don't give up, do you?" She grinned. "Never." And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to be okay with that. Days had passed since their last battle, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, there was peace. No warning sirens blaring through the ship, no enemy ships tailing them through deep space, no transmissions filled with threats, demands, or bound notices. Just silence, just them. Paul had spent so long running, fighting, surviving that the absence of danger felt foreign. His muscles were still wired for conflict, his mind still half expecting disaster at any moment. But no alarms came, no enemies found them. They had once stood in the dimly lit cockpit, staring out into the abyss of space. A remote system far beyond the usual trade routes, hidden from the reach of those who had once hunted them. No one would find them here. But that wasn't what unsettled him. It was her. Nyx had changed everything. He could feel her before she even stepped into the room. Her presence, her warmth, the way the air shifted when she was near. She moved like a shadow, her bare feet silent against the cold floor. But Paul had learned to recognize her presence without needing to see her. She had a gravity to her, something undeniable, something impossible to ignore, and right now it was all directed at him. Paul didn't turn when she stopped behind him, but he could hear the soft inhale of her breath, the subtle rustle of fabric. Ash leaned against the doorway. Then a touch, gentle fingertips brushing over his bare shoulder, trailing down his back in an absent-minded, almost possessive emission. He exhaled through his nose. "You're quiet, Nyx," hummed the sound, low and indulgent. "I am content." Paul glanced either over his shoulder, his voice edged with amusement. "Didn't think that was possible for you." She smiled, endlessly confident. "I have all that I desire." Her fingers trailed lower, nails lightly grazing down his spine before settling to his waist. Her touch was lazy, unhurried, like she had all the time in the universe to map him. Paul stiffened just slightly, his breath slowing. Nyx felt it. She stepped closer, pressing her body against his back, her arms sliding around his waist from behind. She sighed against his skin, the heat of her breath searing. "You resist me," she murmured, her lips grazing the nape of his neck. "Yet you let me touch you." Paul clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edge of the console. "You always have to push, don't you?" Nyx smiled against his skin. "I push because you like it." Paul's chest rose and fell in slow, controlled breaths, but his fingers twitched when she dragged her lips down the curve of his shoulder. Not quite a kiss, but close enough to set these pulse hammering. Then, in a motion too smooth to effortless, she turned him to face her. Paul let her, because of course he did. NX tilted her head, studying him like he was a puzzle she had already solved. "You are always the one in control, aren't you?" Paul swallowed hard. Her hand slid up, pressing against his chest, slow, deliberate, possessive. Then, without hesitation, she pushed him backward. Paul stumbled forth. First time he felt off balance. He landed against the pilot seat, breath knocked from his lungs as Nyx followed him down, straddling his lap with effortless grace. His hands instinctively gripped her hips as if on reflex. Nyx smirked. Paul stared up at her, stunned, not because she was on top of him, but because he realized he wanted her there. And Nyx, she knew it. She felt it. In the way his hands tightened against her thighs, in the way his chest rose sharply beneath her touch, in the way his breath shuddered when she rolled her hips down against his Paul's vision blurred for a second. Damn her, Nick sighed, dragging her nails down his stomach, enjoying the way his muscles tensed beneath her fingertips. She leaned in slowly, letting her lips hover over his. Not yet. She wanted him to break first. Paul knew that, and yet he was dangerously close to doing exactly that. Nick's voice dipped, rich and indulgent. You have given me many things, husband. Paul swallowed, his grip tightening against her waist. Yeah. Nick's lips ghosted over his, her breath sweet and teasing. But you have not yet given this. Paul's resolve snapped. His hand shot up, fingers tangling into her hair as he dragged her mouth to his. Nick's gasped please, triumphant. So damn eager as he finally gave in. The kiss was fire and surrender, an unspoken admission of what had been building for too long. Nick's moaned against his lips, rolling her body against his, drinking in the heat, the raw hunger of him. Paul wasn't gentle. He pulled her closer, forcing her to feel the tension he had been holding back. For so long Nick loved it, she whined, nails biting into his shoulders, a silent plea for more. Paul gave it to her. Paul had never been a man who let himself fall. Not in battle, not in life, and certainly not for someone else. And yet here he was, and ways very where. The press of her body against his, the heat of her skin, the way her breath hitched as he dragged his hands down her back. She arched into him, her nails tracing fire along his shoulders, her silver eyes dark with something raw, something unchained. Paul's fingers tightened at her waist as she moved against him, slow and deliberate, teasing, testing, push. His pulse thundered beneath his skin, his body a live wire of tension and surrender. You take too much pleasure in this, he muttered, voice rough. Nick smirked against his jaw, nipping lightly before whispering, because you finally stopped running. Paul exhaled sharply. Damn her. Her lips ghosted over his, soft but insistent, as if dar him to meet her halfway. And he did. Their mouths collided in something deep, slow, consuming, a kiss that left no room for doubt, no hesitation between them anymore. Nick moaned into him a pleased, sultry sound, her hands threading into his hair as she pulled him deeper. Paul let her for the first time. He let himself let himself feel everything. The way she moved against him, how perfectly she fit in his hands. The way she sighed when his lips found the curve of her throat. She was all fire and certainty, a woman who took what she wanted without hesitation. But so was Paul flipped their positions before she could react, pressing her down against the seat beneath them, pinning her there with his weight. NYX gasped, her pupils blown wide, lips swollen from his kiss. Then she smiled. Paul chuckled, his breath hot against her neck. You like being hunted, hadn't you? Nyx tilted her head, baring her throat to him. Only by you. Something inside. Paul snop. He kissed her again, slow and deep, tasting the victory in her breathless sigh. Their bodies moved in a slow, burning rhythm of need and understanding, as if they had always been meant to fit together like this. NYX whispered something in her native tongue, a prayer, a claim, a vow. Paul didn't know the words, but he felt them in the way she clung to him, the way she sighed his name like it belonged to her alone. And maybe, just maybe, it did, because Paul was done running, and, for the first time, he had someone worth staying for.